place. Tonight's presentation is by Crawford County historian Sandy Porter. He is well known in the Crawford County area for his...
Careful. Careful what you say there.
For his everlasting knowledge of areas of special interest to him. The John Brown Society is one of those. I met Sandy through work. I work at the Crawford County Planning Association, and he is a gentleman that will turn over every piece of stick and stone to find something that's more intriguing than the next thing he found. So tonight we're so happy and grateful to have him, and we hope you enjoy what he has to offer us that about the Keystone Ordnance Works that a lot of us are very interested in learning.
And I appreciate you having me here. And folks, I thought the dinner was wonderful. What do you say?
All right, thank you.
I thank these ladies. I know they've put a lot of time and effort into this, and I thought it was a really good meal.
Right.
And I want to find the lady that made those pies.
Thank you all for coming.
All right, just to give you a little background, myself, I retired from the state police at 25 years, and I've always had an interest in history. I think it's fascinating. I think there's much to learn. Unfortunately, today I don't think there's as much history taught as should be. There's a lot of interesting facets to history. Currently, I do research for the Crawford County Historical Society. I do research for the Quinnipiac Lake Historical Society, and I'm on the board of directors for the John Brown Tannery, which we've been excavating that site for the last 3 years. And so, and I'm always on the lookout for new and interesting things. And tonight I'm going to hopefully educate you on one facet of Crawford County's history. Before we get started, I thought just to give you some amazing facts about history that are interesting is that many years ago in Scotland there was a new game invented, and the game was ruled gentlemen only, ladies forbidden, and thus the word golf. That's where it originated. So you ladies know where the word golf came from. Some other interesting tidbits that I always kind of like to look at. Life in England in the 1500s. Lead cups were used to drink ale or whiskey. And the combination would sometimes knock people out for a couple days. And somebody walking along the road would take them for dead, and they would prepare them for burial. Well, what they would do, they were laid out on the kitchen table, if you can imagine this, for a couple of days, and the family would gather around, eat, drink, and see if they would wake up. So this is where the term holding awake came from. So there's a little bit. Another interesting thing in the 1500s, most people got married in June because they took their yearly bath in May. They weren't big on bathing back then. And they were still smelling pretty good by June, so they were starting to smell, so brides carried a bouquet of flowers, and that's where the bouquet of flowers came from. An ominous background. The other one was in England, the houses had thatched roofs, and they were mud and thatch, and usually the cats and the dogs would sleep in the thatched roof, and when you had a heavy rainfall, the cats and dogs would slide off the roof or fall through the roof, and hence we have the expression, it's raining cats and dogs. A couple other things here. There was a personal hygiene back in the Middle Ages was quite a thing. A lot of people had complexion problems, acne, pock marks, and the women would spread wax over their face to hide up their blemishes. They wanted to look good. And so they would, if a woman, she said, if a woman stared at another woman, she was told to mind your own beeswax. And if they sat too close to a fire when they were socializing, the heat from the fire would melt the wax coating on their face, and that's the expression, losing face. And one other one that I'll run by you is back in the early 1700s, politicians would run against each other, and politicians would like to know, they wanted to know what people were saying about them. So they would hire people to go into different taverns, and they would say, I want you to go into the taverns, go in there, sit down, listen to what people are saying, and come back and tell me. And they would say, go in there, sit down, sip a little ale, and listen to what they're saying. Thence we get the term gossip. Enough of that. This evening I'm going to talk to you about probably one of the most interesting and extensive and exotic facets of the history of Crawford County. We're going to talk about the Keystone Ordnance Works, commonly called the KOW. It was also referred to as the TNT plant. Now, what they basically did at the TNT plant was they manufactured TNT. And TNT is the short term for trinitrotoluene, which is it's explosive. They manufactured a dry version called flake TNT. Okay, this is what the flake TNT looked like. This would be the finished product that they manufactured. And it looked kind of like oatmeal, an orangish color. This is what it looks like close up. This was the end product at the plant, what they called it flake TNT. Now, TNT, one of the reasons TNT is used as an explosive is several reasons. It could be manufactured safely, less than nitroglycerin or powder, gunpowder. It was stable in moisture. It had explosive qualities, good shattering effect. It could be stored for long periods of time. It wasn't easily detonated, and it would melt at a low temperature. And the reason that they liked it, it could be melted at a low temperature. It was manufactured at the Keystone Ordnance Works. It was shipped to other plants in a solid form. It could be melted down into a liquid form. And whatever you could pour it into any shape, it could be shaped, whatever container you poured it into, it conformed to it. So it was very, very useful. Here's in Eldred, PA, there was a munitions plant, and they would actually melt, because it had a low melting point. You could take the flake TNT, you heat it to around 170 degrees, it would melt into a liquid. Then they could take the liquid, and as you see in this photograph, these are mortar shells. They could pour it into a mortar shell, and it would conform right to the shape of the shell. Here's another. You can see a little better there, where they're actually, this one they're using a machine to put the liquid TNT in. Now this plant was in Eldred, PA. One of the interesting aspects that I found out was that during the Second World War, the British came over to the United States and they built several munitions plants. 1941, they were being bombed by the Germans, and they needed a place where they could manufacture munitions safely. So they had some plants, and Eldred was one of those plants. Now, in making TNT, and I'm not going to go into, I'm going to simplify it. There's a lot of different chemicals, but basically you use toluene, nitric acid, liquid ammonia, and a concentrated sulfuric acid. That's the basic chemicals. I could go into a whole program just about the process of manufacturing the TNT, but that's just a basic idea. Okay, now War Department in 1941 decides they want to build a munitions plant. Now we had munitions plants at Ravenna, Ohio, and Sandusky. The military decides it's 1941, it's in the fall of 1941. We've got a war going on in Europe. We've got the Japanese threatening us, and it's almost imminent that we're going to be at war with the Japanese. So the government decides that they need a munitions plant. And they decide on Greenwood Township, Crawford County. And for those of you not familiar with it, if you go down Route 79, where PPG is located at today is where the original plant was. Now you say, why Crawford County of all places? You know, out in the middle of nowhere, Crawford County. Well, one reason was water supply. It takes a lot of water to manufacture TNT. So they had to, it takes 25 million gallons of water a day to manufacture the TNT. So they had water here, you had Pymatuning Swamp, you had a high water table, you had plenty of water. They ended up putting up 18 wells in the Conneaut Marsh. They had 6 underground reservoirs, a 1,000-gallon elevated tank, and they put up 3 75,000-gallon tanks before they were done. So water was a concern. They had the Erie Railroad. They had a railroad connection in through Geneva. The land could be obtained at a reasonable rate. And the other reason, which a lot of people didn't know, was being Crawford County, we have more clouds in Crawford County year-round than any other place in the country. This was a critical factor. At that time, you didn't know. Germany could have come over here and bombed. Japan could have bombed. So they wanted a place with cloud cover. What better place than Crawford County, you know? This is an aerial photograph off of Google. Just shows you basically, here's 79, 285 Geneva. This is, well, this will be today what's left of the plant. This is where PPG is located today, and I'll go into that a little bit further. And actually, it takes up 3/4 of Greenwood Township. Now, what happened was in November, October, November, appraisers started contacting the local residents. They wanted this land, and they wanted 15,000 acres of land, 22 square miles is what this came out to be. But the appraisers, the land had to be appraised and purchased quickly. The government wanted to get this thing on the move. So in the fall of 1941, the appraisers came around. They started contacting local residents. They appealed to their patriotic duty. They came in and they told them, they gave them a price, what they felt their land was worth. And a few of the residents, a lot of them went along with what the government offered them. Some of them didn't believe, a lot of them didn't believe that they were given a fair price, and they challenged the government. And they were basically told that they were warned, condemnation procedure under the right of eminent domain is used only as a last resort. Basically, you take what we give you or we're going to take it anyhow. Now, these people weren't given a lot of time. A lot of them were notified in November, December. They were told they had till the spring to get out. Now, these are third, fourth generation families that have been here. And they ended up with approximately 166 families had to be relocated from the area. And it created a lot of animosity. They weren't real happy with the fact. One farmer, I read an account, he was a dairy farmer. He didn't even realize that he was going to be moved. He went down in his barn one day to milk his cows, and he saw survey stakes across through his barn. That was the first indication he had. They didn't get a lot of government assistance. A lot of these folks had to move in the middle of winter. And it was basically neighbor, a lot of it was neighbor helping neighbor, loading up wagons, moving out. So it took place in the winter with blizzards and bad weather. And the government, they weren't supplied a lot of transportation for this. So there were, as I say, there were 166 family. So the construction, now if you're interested, you could get into a whole program dealing with the relocation process. Today, probably, if they would have tried to do this today with the attorneys and litigation today, probably the plant would have never got built, or by the time they got done with all the attorneys, the war would have been over. Back then, people were more patriotic and were willing to go along with the program. There's a paper written called Mercer County History, and it's a paper that's written by Lou Ann Rung, and Mercer County Historical Society has it. It's a very well done paper. She went around and interviewed a lot of these farm people and got their personal stories about what happened when they were relocated. And if you would want to know more about the relocation process, the good and the bad side, I'd highly recommend that you read this paper. Now, construction began in January of 1942. This is a newspaper clipping. This, you know, they say one photo is worth 1,000 words. Here's a fella here, Dan Daggert, an old fella, found out that he was going to have to leave the farm. And I don't think he's too happy about it. Now, these are some of these photos that I'm going to show you were actual photos that were taken by the government. They were classified. We came to possession to them at the Historical Society. So some of these are the actual photographs that they took. This is when they started the construction. Now, this is basically showing you an aerial view taken back then, and I'll go into more detail. Okay, this was broken up into there were three main areas. The main areas in this Ordnance Works, you had this area in here, which was administrative buildings. You had this area over here, which is what they called the powder and the sulfuric acid plant. These are what they called the lines. There were 12 of them. Now the lines, they were 12 identical units, and basically this is where the TNT was manufactured. They consisted of a series of buildings. You had machinery tanks. You had what they called a flake house, a wash house, bi-house, tri-house, and mono houses. So you basically started at this end, it went through here to the end of each line, and then it was shipped onto a shipping. It's just oversimplifying it, but that was basically where the TNT was manufactured. This was where they built what they called an oleum plant, which is nothing more than a plant for manufacturing concentrated sulfuric acid. Now the other acids they had brought in by rail. So this was now, when the plant was started, it was under the supervision of the Army Ordnance. They hired a company from New York, Fraser Brace. They were in charge of basically the day-to-day operations, the building, the day-to-day operations. And you also had a general chemical company which was in charge of basically the sulfuric acid plant. This is just a better location. You had, these were the TNT lines here. This was where you had your power plant, your sulfuric administrative, and 2 miles south of there is where you had the storage area for your thing, and I'll go into more detail on that. Here's a better close-up. This would be the acid, they call the acid and power area. They had a huge power plant, and I'll show you that shortly. This was administrative. These were the lines. It started through here, and they would end up at the end here, and they would put it in 50-pound boxes to be shipped. This is just another to show you how these were lined up. It gets a lot more complicated. I'm just giving you the basics here. There's another view of it. There's the lines there. This is the power plant, huge power plant. This is the sulfuric acid. This was a reservoir for water. They had barracks and they had administrative area. And of course you had the railroad going through. Now this shows you when it was in construction, this is one of the water towers that they used for water. There's another view of it. This would be the power plant here. This was the sulfuric acid plant. This is what they call an acid, what they call it the acid area. You can see these were stamped at one time confidential. Security was tight. It was there was tight security, and I'll go into more detail on that. There's another view. Now the cost of building the plant was approximately $45 million to build the plant. Now the first year that they started in January, they ended up with over 500 buildings before they were done. There's the main gate, the main safety sign at the main gate. Now, when the plant finally, they started in January, October of 1942. They started in January of 42. By October 1942, they had over 500 buildings constructed, and they ended up, they had 8,000 workers there, 8,000 people. And in the month of June, they had, in June alone, they had over 1,000 injuries. Mainly these were construction workers, stepping on nails, cutting their fingers off with the saws, this type of thing. You had a lot of construction going on, so you had a lot of minor injuries going on at that time. And once it was in full production and it was fully constructed, it dropped back to around 2,500 workers. Now, the workers, there was a colonel that was in charge, and the workers you had, when it went into full production, they had, I believe, 7 or 8 of the 12 lines actually got into production. They were manufacturing, and I find this amazing, they were manufacturing 600,000 pounds of TNT per day. That's a lot of TNT. They were really producing. It was one of the top plants in the United States. 600,000 pounds per day of TNT. Now, of course, you had and I'll show you, you had a problem. You had 8,000 workers. Where do you put the workers? Now, they had workers from Grove City. They had workers from down in Franklin. They had 62 families out of Franklin. They had 120 employees from Oil City. You had a problem. You had all these workers. They set up some trailer courts there. They set up a 1,200-man barracks there. But you still had the problem. You had single men, you had married men. So they went to Oil City, Franklin. Anybody that had a home, that would put them up there. They put them up at Allegheny College, Cambridge Springs at Alliance College, Meadville, anybody that had a room for rent. Morgan Village, which was built at Meadville, was built specifically to house the workers. So you had a lot of workers here in the area. They would recruit workers from Erie. They even went into Pittsburgh to recruit people to work there. They needed demand power. One woman that I talked to, she worked the switchboard in Meadville for Meadville Telephone. She's walking down Chestnut Street one day, and a recruiter came up to her and said, I understand you work for the telephone company. We'd like to have you come and work at the Keystone Ordnance. And she said, well, how much are you going to pay me? Well, she said at the time she was getting $11 a week, and they told her $26 a week. It was a no-brainer, you know. And they were paid well. The average workers were $11, $12 a week or more. Well, they were more than that. So the pay was good when they were there. They had buses that they would transport people, and I'll show you some of those in a minute. The buses they had were like our standard school buses. They were green, 40-some passenger buses. They had 7 buses that would run to Greenville, Seneca. They also had a motor pool. Some of the people were given extra gas rations to go pick up people. They had buses going to Cambridge Springs, Edinburgh. They would bring them in. And it says in August of 1942, KOW buses transported, write this down, it'll be a test, 165,466 workers, 150,736 miles without an accident. Young man, do you know what I just said? Did you remember that?
I'm still playing.
Yeah, I see you over there. And they had, one of the problems they had was some of the plants that had was keeping the workers there, absenteeism. You know, they wanted the people to be there. So they tried to, what they did was, it was a forerunner of what our modern corporations do today. They make you feel like you're part of a family. They involve you in company activities. Well, the government did that. They had facilities, activities for employees that were unheard of at that time. Well, they had a full-fledged fire department, the 10-bed hospital. They had a cafeteria. They had a weekly newspaper called The Blast. They put that out weekly, which makes our Tribune look bad. And they put all the news, every little bit of news that was in there. They had softball teams, rifle team, bowling team. They had dances. They had a chorus troupe. They even featured Fay Wray, a 1940 starlet, Fay Wray. Does anybody here know who Fay Wray was? She was in the first Tarzan movie. Don't say anything, you'll give away your age. So they really tried to make the workers feel like they were part of a part of something bigger than themselves, and it probably did help with their absenteeism. This is headquarters staff. You have a colonel in charge several times during the course. This would be the administrative area. You had a cafeteria in your administrative buildings. They tell me that my mother-in-law worked there, and they tell me the food was good and the food was cheap. So, And they had guard shacks around the perimeter. You had 15,000 acres of land. You had double fences around it. Security was at its peak. This is one of the guard shanties. Now, one of the other things, I'll go back. Naturally, no matches. That was a no-no. In fact, a lot of the workers were issued coveralls with no pockets in them. And of course, bear in mind, this is in the 40s when John Wayne and everybody smoked cigarettes. You weren't cool unless you had a cigarette, and women weren't chic unless they had a cigarette. So smoking was a key factor, but they were not allowed to smoke. And they had these coveralls they issued to them. Penalty, first offense, 6 days off, second offense, termination. You just couldn't be smoking around there. And they would come in, I talked to some of the workers, they would come in periodically and check them. Make sure nobody was smoking, which must have been rough to have to go through an 8-hour shift without a cigarette. That must have been pure torture for some people. And of course, you always have the 10%. I hope those boxes were empty. I'm assuming they were empty. But, there we go. There's always one in the crowd, That's to push the envelope. And of course, we have your typical scenes of Crawford County snow. And I don't even know why they took these pictures, whether it was just to show the snow but as you can see, there's some more snow. Like the car. This was a guardhouse, one of the guardhouses. The chemical company. Icicles. Some more general views of the TNT. You had a lot of pipe running above ground. These are some more. There's the water towers, which are still there today. This was the manufacturing line, what they called the mono house, the bi house, the tri house. And take particular note of these right here. I'll show you.
Is that where they actually cooked it?
Yeah, that's where they actually would cook it. It started at one end of the line and went to each building, and by the time it got to the end, then they would cook it, heat it, dry it. And
my mother worked in one of those.
She worked in a flake house.
She told about the slide that you go down in case.
Don't jump ahead of me now. I'm getting to that. One of my favorite photographs. This was the fire department. This was the water cooler. Look at the size of that. Now you see water coolers on top of buildings. Look at the size of this compared to the car. That gives you an idea of the enormity of this. Here's another one of the buildings. Administrative building. They had a box factory where they would box this up, and I'll show you that shortly. A barracks. Here's some of the sulfuric acid tanks that they would store the acid in. These are toluene tanks, ammonia tanks. These are some of the buildings that were left over. Sulfuric acid is some of the houses where they made the sulfuric acid. It's what they called a flake house, where they actually made the final flake product. And the women that worked in there, I talked to them, they learned early on to wear covering on their hair because they said the chemicals that come out of there, they'd be redheads. It would change the color. They had red hair. There was a lot of dust. Now, the KOW they were adamant about them wearing breathing apparatus and things because there was a lot of this dust flying around. One fellow told me he worked in the motor pool, and one of the trucks came in and it had all this dust on it, and he went to weld something on the frame, and he said it looked like a sparkler going off, but nobody got hurt, but it was just... There you see those again. So you can see by the photographs, it was no small operation. It was quite an extensive operation, quite complicated. Now this was a power plant. You can imagine to run a facility like this with over 500 and some buildings, you're going to have to use a lot of power. And of course, back then it was coal. And this would be your power plant, your chute for, and you had the train tracks right there could bring the coal in. And here's a photograph showing you a bulldozer. I would love to know how much coal per day they use, how many tons of coal. It must have been an astronomical amount of coal. They probably had to bring train loads of coal in there every day to keep that going. Now, KOW is here. You go about 2 miles south. They had to store the ammunition. They would pack it in 50-pound boxes, and some of it would be shipped out by train or truck. They would store it, and it's about 2 miles south of there. And you have, there were 100 of these, what they called them they were concrete bunkers. They're commonly referred to as the igloos because of the way they were constructed. And of course, you wouldn't want your storage area too close to your main plant for obvious reasons. They were lined up in rows. There was 100 of them. And they were constructed of concrete. And there's an aerial shot showing today what's left of them. And these are what the igloos will look like. They used 90 tons of cement for each one. They were about, some of the walls were over a foot thick. The floors on them were even thicker. They were 60 foot long, 27 foot wide, approximately 10 foot high. And they were buried in the roof, buried on either side with earth, and you had a roof. The idea behind it was that if there was an explosion, it would direct the blast upward to try to blow it upward. They were staggered in rows, and they were staggered apart so that if one of them blew up for whatever reason, you wouldn't get a chain reaction. So you've got these, you've got over a foot of concrete here, you've got all this earth piled up. And here's one of them today. Now, obviously, you've got earth piled around them. They're concrete, warm in the winter, cool in the summer. Makes an ideal thing. In the 50s, they decided to sell off some of the igloos. There's, you can see the walls there. These are some of what they look like today, some of the ones that weren't utilized. There gives you a better view. These are some of the ones that were left in the original condition. They're still there today. But they sold off some of them in the 50s, and people bought them. And you'll see here in a minute, good old American ingenuity. Built houses out of them. You had a ready-made basement. You had a ready-made foundation. And some of the folks down there turned them into really nice, habitable. Where there's a will, there's a way. You can see here Greenwood Township used it as a township building. Here's another house. Township building. One clever farmer there built his barn. Why not? Now, they also had, you had the Army there, you had some Army officers, so obviously you had to have staff quarters for your officers. So they built 20 houses, and their houses are still standing today, what they call Staff Row, Staff Avenue. You can still see the houses today, but if you go up Delano Road coming from Route 19, you go off onto Staff Avenue, the original houses are still there today. They're private residences, and they've been modified. This is what the houses would have looked like back in 1942. Look kind of Spartan by today's standards, but and these are the same houses today. They're all private residences. They've been just modified. You have the standard windows back then. They used to put the windows on the corners. Now this was a trailer camp for employees. They're not Winnebagos by any shade of the imagination, but they were. These are some of the vehicles that they used. They used some of these vehicles for patrolling the area. They were mainly Chevy pickups and GMCs. I can't tell you whether that's 41 or 42. It's before my time. These were some of the buses that they used to transport. You can see the names on the buses. Jamestown, Meadville. See, there's Jamestown. Meadville, Greenville. These were the buses that they used. They were your standard military type buses, nothing fancy about them. Now, this is interesting, and I didn't find this out until a couple of years ago. I had a fellow contact me, he's a historian for General Electric. But General Electric, actually, they had locomotives. General Electric built 3 locomotives for the Keystone Ordnance Works. They built one in 1942, 43, and 1945. And this came from the Museum of Erie GE History. Here's one of the engines that was built for the Keystone. You can see KOW number 3. This engine you see there is this engine today. It's still in existence. It's in the South Branch Valley Railroad in Moorefield, West Virginia. And the railroad guys would just love to bring that up here. But it's still in use, as far as I know it is. Now, we have women employed in the lab. And one thing here, bear in mind, World War II's going on. The men are off to war. So women, we started hiring a lot of women to fill in the positions while the men were at war. Equal opportunity employer. I understand we have a lady here who worked in the lab. Don't you say a word. And yeah, I understand you worked in the lab. And this is one photo of the women in the lab. I don't know, do you recognize any of the women there?
Hey, their faces look familiar, but I haven't seen them quite.
May I ask how old you are?
I'll be 90 in a couple months.
How old?
90.
Congratulations.
That was 70 years ago I worked there.
I wouldn't remember faces either. Here's another photo. This is Dorothy Clark of Sagertown and Gladys Sweet. Does that ring a bell with you?
The names.
Names sound familiar to you. All right, we won't press you. What I thought was neat on this picture, you see this sign up here. It says the enemy has ears. There used to be a lot of those up. Now, one thing about in the plant, security was tight. People, and I'll show you here in a little bit, were given badges. They were assigned specific areas to work. But in some of the buildings, they were escorted to their building. Were you escorted to the lab when you came in?
They hauled us down the buses.
Okay. One of the women I talked to that worked in the lab said the supervisor would escort her from the gate to the lab. People would work in one room. They wouldn't know what was going on in the next room. It was for security. It was tight. A lot of the people I talked to didn't really know the full what was going on there, because for security reasons, the less you knew, the less you talked about. There was an incident I read somewhere where 2 of the workers were on the bus coming from the KOW, and one worker was discussing with another worker his job. Somebody overheard him and reported him, well, he got fired. You weren't allowed to discuss what you were doing. You know, you were limited to the area that you worked in a specific job. How much training did you have to work in the lab?
I just took special courses in that
I understand.
before I got the
Yeah,
job.
some of the girls, they actually took them, like from high school, they sent them to Allegheny College for a few months, and they trained them in their specific jobs for the lab. They were trained at Allegheny College.
See, I had been working at the American Viscos.
Oh, you were working at the Viscos? Okay.
And we made at the American Viscos, we made the yarn for the parachutes. And also we made the spray.
So you had a little bit of a chemistry background or a little bit of...
They didn't train me special there.
May I ask, how much were you, do you recall how much you were paid a week when you worked there?
I don't recall, but at the time I thought it was good pay.
Yeah, most of the workers, it was a lot more than the average worker around. You were paid well, from my understanding, that the workers were paid well. And here's the first woman draftsman that was hired there. So the women played a significant part there. They worked on the lines. Like I said, as I say, a lot of the men were off at war. Now, we have the Keystone, the Guard. They were an auxiliary police force. They had 3 companies of 100 men, approximately 100 men each, and they had a mounted troop with 48 horses. And they were equipped with patrol cars, motorcycles, and I believe 48 horses. And security was strict. They had a double fence. They had, I'll show you here. They changed uniforms. Initially, I believe this is what they started out with, uniform. I love the cars in the background. And you see that this would probably, I'm guessing, be early on when they opened, because they had got more women later on. There's one woman here. Here's some more of their officers. This is a fella I wouldn't want to catch me coming over the fence. And later on, they went to a uniform which very much looks like the state police uniform. Very similar. Smokey Bear hat. And they decided to go with the mounted troop because they needed to patrol on the outer perimeters of the fence line where there weren't roads. So they would use the horses, and they decided to bring the horses up and train some of the local people. They brought a cavalry unit up to teach them how to ride the horses. And I talked to a woman that was she was a secretary there. She told me, she said she didn't think that this is a fellow by the name of Lyle Horn who lived in the area. His son gave me these photos. This was the mounted troop. There's his father. But it didn't work out real well. They had some problems. I mean, you don't take somebody in a short period. It takes a little while to learn how to handle a horse, I guess. And I know I rode him at the academy, and we had guys that had never been on a horse in their life, and it was scary. And so they had a few problems. And here's where they brought some women in, the Guardettes, they called them. Here's Guard Ewing. He buys a bond a week. And back then, and I'll show you, they had bond rallies. It was a big thing. Cost a lot of money to run the war. They were always having bond rallies, bond parades to raise money. And they always tried to get as many employees as they could to give the bond. The women were not to be left out. There's a newly designed woman's uniform. In cases of emergency, she could fly around with that cape. Not really. Cute uniform, though. Now this is where they would take the TNT, the flake TNT, when it was in that form. It was like a flaky, powdery. There was a lot of dust they had to wear. And you can see these 50-pound boxes. They lined them. And this was a fellow that I met up in Edinburgh. Has one of the boxes. These are what the boxes look like. And these are some of the fellows. This is banding the boxes. This was their job, to band the boxes. It's a tough-looking crew. And here's one of the last boxes of TNT and the kernels there. And of course they had their own quality control. Every once in a while they go back out in the South 40 there and test some of the TNT to see if it was, be kind of an interesting job. Here's some of the boys that worked in explosives. You can see there's no pockets in the coveralls. Of course, I'm sure some of them snuck a smoke in there once in a while somehow. Here's one of the trucks that they used to transport. Here's, by these signs, they should know, they were called angel wagons for obvious reasons. And apparently they never had any accidents or major explosions. There's some of the trucks. I don't know if I'd want to drive one of those, but these were skids where they would bring the finished TNT down to the storage areas. You didn't want a lot of metal on metal contact, sparks and things like that. This is one of what they call the tri-house. You can see these here. Here comes it's my favorite picture. Now you can, they were, if in the manufacturing process in like the flake houses and that, if the temperature got to above a certain temperature, they were advised to get the heck out of there, bail out, and you didn't have much time. So they were trained to use these slides. Some of them even had showers at the bottom to wash them off. So I think if it was me, I'd probably just jump out the window, but you know, they were trained to use these slides. He's enjoying that. These are some of the supervisory personnel.
That building looked like it was built up on stilts.
Yeah, it was built up on stilts. It was built high up. Yeah, there were various shaped buildings. Some were concrete, some were wood, some were metal. They were all metal, and I'll show you some of those here in a little bit. These were some of the advertising that they put in the local papers. Give you an idea of the variety of jobs. You had an auxiliary operator, a car washer, radiator repairman, acid trainers. They were pretty self-sufficient. They did all their own maintenance there on their vehicles. They always had maintenance men, carpenters. And this was what they called the Keystone Blast. It was a newspaper they started. Started out with 4 pages, went up to 8 pages. We have probably 30 copies of them in their Historical Society. But it was a weekly newspaper. It kept everybody up to date on what was going on. This is breaking ground for the new oleum plant. This was the Keystone Cafeteria. This was the 10-bed hospital, Dr. Bates there. Pretty Spartan by today's standards, but back then it was quite. As I say, the first year they had a lot of minor injuries during the construction. You have 8,000 people there and they're constantly doing construction. You're going to have a lot of, the one statistic was over 1,000 people were treated for various injuries, you know, cut fingers, stepping on nails, falling off the scaffolding, things like that. Now, you were issued a badge, round badge, and I'll show you here in a minute, with your photograph on it, and it was color-coded, and it would designate what area you were permitted to go in. Now, you went to get your photograph. We're not talking the exam point here. You didn't sit down and take 3 or 4 pictures and decide which ones you liked the best. They put a sheet up, you stuck your head through the sheet, he snapped the picture, that was it. If you had a bad day or a hangover, you had a bad picture. And as you can see, nothing flattering about those photos, you know. It almost looks like he ought to have a police number underneath there. Now, this was a badge for apparently somebody up in the hierarchy that had permission he could go anywhere that he wanted. Interestingly enough, I interviewed a fella. He was 15 years old. He was a newspaper boy. He would go in every morning at 6 o'clock in the morning with the Post-Gazette, and he was allowed to go anywhere he wanted to go. He said the guards used to tease him because he said, you can go in areas we're not permitted to go. He went in, and he said, with about 75 newspapers every morning, and he sold newspapers. And for, I think, 3 to 5 cents a copy is what it was. But that was his job. Love the hairstyle. Changed a lot since then, hasn't it, ladies? Now, one of the things they had, 1942, they constantly, the Minuteman, they tried to get 100% participation from their employees on buying bonds. That was a big in thing. And they would have these bond rallies. And this particular one in 1942, they had a woman show up. She was a Filipino singing star. And of course, this was a pilot that had been shot down and lost his leg. They would come in and have these rallies to try to raise money. This was a woman, Ms. E. Gonzalez, Filipino opera singer. This was one of the executives there. Look at the number of workers there. This is at the KOW. They would come in, here's a Marine, getting up and giving patriotic talks to get people to buy bonds. You'll note here, these two fellows here playing the piano. I don't know whether that's politically correct today or not, and they have these boxes you'll see here, and what those were was you could send your name to war. You could give them a donation and have your name put on a box of TNT. Huh? That'd be something to put on your Christmas tree. And here's some more of the rally. There's the buses again that they used to transport. Now, this was interesting. In 1943, this was in the blast. If you recall your history at all, December 7th, the Japanese had 5 mini-subs they launched at Pearl Harbor. None of them was successful. One of them is called the H.A. Hamaki 19, I guess it was, 2-man submarine. It beached at Pearl Harbor. And they captured the one crewman, the other one drowned, but they captured it intact. So the Navy took the 2-man submarine. This was the first time they'd ever seen one. Of course, they took it apart, analyzed it, and got what they needed. And somebody came up with the idea, let's use this for a bond drive. So what they did was they put a plexiglass window in the side of the submarine. They put it on a flatbed truck, and they took it on tour all around the United States. And they would have people charge you a quarter, 50 cents or whatever. You could walk up on a platform, and you could actually get to look inside a Japanese submarine. And bear in mind, this time, this was a big, big thing. You actually got to see a Japanese submarine. And I saw this article, and a few years ago, a fellow came into the Historical Society and said, I have some pictures I took in 1943. I was going to throw them away. Would you be interested? And I took one look at them and said, yes, sir. And these were taken by the Stone Church in Meadville. He was there. You can see the people on the platform looking inside the submarine. There's another view of it. You've got state police there. You've got the military, and I guess they raised quite a bit of money with this submarine. They took it all over the United States, and it was quite a sensation. So this is down at the Diamond in Meadville.
Did it end up in Chicago in that one museum up there?
Yeah, it was in Florida for many years. It was down at Florida on display, and they realized that the salt air was getting to it. And they decided to take it out of there because it was being corroded by the salt air. They had it sitting outside. Okay, the plant, the KOW plant was in operation out from October 1942 to February of 1944, 15 months that it was an actual full operation. Then it was shut down temporarily, and it was opened up again on October of 1944 till August of 1945, which was VJ Day. But for all intent and purposes, it was actually in full operation 15 months, which is not a long time when you consider the amount of money and time, but at 600,000 pounds of TNT per day, it did the job. It supplied what the military needed. And there was a decontamination done on it at a cost by the government of $45 million. They went in, supposedly steamed the pipes and decontaminated it. So, and in 1964, the KOW, it was sold to the Meadville Industrial Complex, and then it ended up with Paul Keebert. Ended up buying it. My understanding is that he made some of his money back. He sold some of the road filled, a lot of the blacktop on the roads, recycled it because there were a lot of roads there. And and so it was sold for $500,000. Now, at the end of the war, the plant was shut down, but it was kept on an inactive basis. And it was the KOW went to the War Assets Department. The oleum plant, or the sulfuric acid plant, China came in and wanted to buy it. I believe they bought it. They wanted to ship to China to use it as a fertilizer plant. And they did sell later on 10,000 acres in 1950 were sold back to some of the former owners. They allowed them to come back. And today there's 500 acres of that was used by the National Guard. It's still down there. It's a range. In June of 1966, there was a public auction there. And just to give you an idea of the amount of equipment, this was one of the flyers from the auction. And just to give you the General Chemical Company bought a lot of these tanks. They paid probably close to $500,000 and bought a lot of these big tanks. Yeah, these tanks, welded steel tanks, 1,025 gallons each. Look at some of the equipment that was auctioned off. Hundreds of lathes. Air compressors. Now this is the Keystone Ordnance Works as it looks today. Today there's some probably 50 odd structures left out of the original 500 and some that are still there. This is would be today. This is what's left of it. This is an aerial view. And this is the KOW today. You had PPG, Rusco Industries. There's a couple other tool and die shops there. Keebert owns the majority of that. There's tentative plans now to put in a tire energy plant down there. That's still up in the air. 500 acres of it is still being used by the Army and National Guard. Now, during its heyday, actually, it was an economic boom to Meadville and Geneva. You can imagine all these workers going into Meadville. The population of Meadville went from about 14,000 up to about 18,000, 19,000. They tell me, on a Friday and Saturday night, streets were just packed. So it was really an economic boom to Crawford County, Jamestown, Franklin. There was a lot of money made, a lot of money that was, so it was really an economic boom at the time. And this is what, looking at it today, this is PPG. And PPG plant is basically built, this would have been like the administrative area. What administrative, you can still see the old lines and what's left of them. These were photos. I flew over here about 2 years ago and took photos. You can see this is what's left of the power plant. This is where the sulfuric acid plant, this would have been what's left of the TNT manufacturing lines. There's another view of it. It's all overgrown now. You can still see the water towers that are still there. These are some of the building. This would have been the acid plant, power plant. This is the big power plant. These are some of the, these are 3-story metal buildings. It's probably a small fortune there in just scrap metal.
This is little houses in a row. Right?
They had little wash houses there where they would go in and wash. They were what they called wash houses.
You can see them right
1992. It's what remains of the buildings. This is being used by a tool and die company. These are some of the larger buildings that are still standing. You can see there's a lot of metal there. That's what's left of the power plant. That's the inside of the power plant. And this is an auger, and first time I gave this program, I assumed that auger was used to bring coal into the power plant, and after the program I had an old farmer come up to me and he said, I have to tell you something. He said, that wasn't for the coal. He says, I put that in there, I used to keep my cattle in there, and I used that to bring the grain in. So I said, okay, you know, I appreciate you not saying anything. Some of the old tanks, just to give you an idea, they don't encourage people to go in there for liability issues. There are some with permission to hunt down there. They've caught people in there trying to steal some of the metal, trying to cut up some of the metal and steal metal. So they kind of watch it pretty close. They don't want people wandering around through the area down there. This is what gets people's curiosity from 19. They see those water towers and they know there's something there, but they don't know what. Imagine the amount of lumber. Some of the buildings there, my understanding is some of the local people took some of the lumber was given to them to build their houses later on. But you can imagine the amount of lumber that was used to build that. This was what you might this is what I understand was the lab. Does that look like the lab to you?
I couldn't say for
Huh?
I couldn't say for sure.
Okay. Well, it probably looks a little worse for wear there.
It does look different.
This is what 66 years later, 65 years later, this is what happens to a keg full of nails. It becomes one solid object. I imagine there's still a lot of pipe underground there. This is where one of the shipping buildings. This is one of the, what they call the buy house. There's PPG, there's the existing, the old rail line is still there. These are the warehouses that were along the railroad tracks where they shipped out. This is the picture of the fire department. You'll note the 2 fire trucks here. And these were taken in 1992, showing the fire trucks. And these are the same fire trucks a few years later. Not much left. I was kind of surprised that somebody didn't take those and try to restore them, because they would be quite, I believe they're not the ones, the 1941 Ford truck. Not too much left of it. Yeah, it's past all hope right there. There's the plate on it. It's 1941. I think this says May of 6/9/41. General Ford M60. And of course, typical U.S. government, stamp all the tires. It's an old steamroller that was down there at one time. So you can see, basically, the Keystone Ordnance Works is just basically a fading memory right now. And say in its day, it was an important facility. It was one of the most important, one of the more, I've been asked the question, how many munitions plants were there? I haven't been able to find that out. I've looked and looked to see if I could find an actual number of munitions plants in the United States, but I haven't been able to find an exact. There were a lot of them, smaller ones. This was probably one of the larger ones. Sandusky, Ohio still has, it's still a military, it's still like being used as a facility over there. But that's basically what's left of it today. It's just a fading memory. And there's cows grazing there and hunting, and once a year they do some fishing in the lake there. So I just kind of wanted to give you an overview of, I hope you have an idea now what was there, a general idea of what was there. Tried to keep it simple for you without getting into a lot of complicated things. And I appreciate your coming, and I hope you enjoyed the program. Anybody have any questions?
Did they have any considerations to open it up during the Korean War?
No. They kept it. They kept the skeleton crew of about, I believe, 40 or 50 people there through the 50s to the late 50s. It just kind of kept the maintenance on it. It was kind of in a mothball state. Until they finally sold it. They just kind of kept the maintenance up, some heat in a few of the buildings, and that was it. They never used it again. I think they had probably the intention, if they needed it, they could reactivate it.
And how many people were displaced when it was shut down?
There was approximately 166 families that were displaced at the time. Yeah, and like I say, some of them came back, could buy back their property.
No, I meant workers.
Or workers?
Yeah.
Well, there was roughly around 8,000 during the construction phase, and it went down to around 2,500, which is still a boon to the county. I mean, like as I say, the economy in the county just went skyrocketed.
Yeah.
So, yes, sir.
Was there ever any fatal accident?
They say no. I know there were injuries there. There were some workers that were burned. There were accidents that happened there. They said, I didn't read anything about explosion. I talked to one of the men that worked there. He's 97 now. He said, I used to drive the colonel around in a Jeep, and he said, we went by one of the flake houses one day, heard an explosion, and saw the roof go up 3 or 4 feet in the air. So, you know, they claim that there were no, I haven't read any, there's nothing that I've read that's documented that said there was any fatalities. They did have some men had heart attacks while they were working there. And they had, I believe, some workers that fell off a scaffolding and that were hurt while during the construction phase. But there's nothing there that I've never seen anything that indicated that anybody was directly killed because of working with the chemicals. Yes, sir.
How long was the mounting security division in service there?
Well, apparently they kept it. They sold the horses in 1946. They were auctioned off. So I think they probably kept it right through there. I don't feel bad. I had that happen in the middle of one of mine. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about workers being bussed in, so who lived in the barracks?
Well, they had, I think what they did, they had a barracks there for the, of course, for the guards, and they had probably some of the single men. There were men there that had their families, though. They had, and they would go to, like Franklin, some of the homes, they opened up the homes to the families or rented them to them. So they had some single men, probably put as many of them up as they could on the facility there. And then, like I say, there were people, they were housing them at Allegheny College, even Conneaut Lake Park, Conneaut Lake, some of the hotels rented rooms out. And it was a real problem. They were constantly advertising in the paper for rooms or facilities for the workers.
I saw on most of the pictures that it was ordnance. It wasn't an ordinance.
Ordinance.
There was no I in it. Sometimes it had an I in it.
Yeah.
Some of it didn't.
That's a law, like an ordinance passed by.
But that's,
Ordinance, the military.
Ordinance is military. Ordinance. They would call it ORD, I think it was NANCA, and then the ordinance is actually ammunition ordinance.
and there was one other thing. It was like the second or third slide that you had. There, the headlines of the newspaper, and it talked about the Nazis and Crimea.
And what?
Crimea.
Crimea, yeah. Well, the Germans at that time, see, 1940, that the war was going in Europe, and the Germans were, they were overrunning Europe. And that's one of the reasons they wanted to get this plant built, because they knew it was inevitable. And Japan, at that time, they knew that we were eventually going to, one way or the other, we were going to be at war with Japan. It was just a question of when and where, and of course, December 7th. So they were gearing up. I've read history accounts where FDR, even back in the late 30s, he started building more planes because they realized that it was just a matter of time before we tried to stay out of it. They knew eventually we were going to be involved in it. So that's why they were in a hurry to get these plants built.
You said it cost $40 million to build it back then. Have you ever seen the figure that would equate to today's, what it would cost?
Equated to today's? You would ask me that question, wouldn't you? I don't know what that, I know back then, that's a lot of money. You could probably quadruple that. I mean,
With the environmental impact.
yeah, and you'd have, today you would be getting into environmental things, you get into, I asked a couple of the workers, I said, what did you do with some of this material? Well, we dumped it in the ground. There really wasn't any regulations as far as disposal of things. Now, they claim they went in there were the 45 million and they cleaned it up. It is supposedly cleaned up. But I don't know. I mean, that's, yes, ma'am.
Where in West Virginia did you say that GE engine is?
You would ask me that, wouldn't you?
Brockton?
I'd have to go back and look. I'll show it to you after we're
Sandy,
done.
you seem to be bombing now, so I'll say.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
Any questions? I just wanted to thank everybody so much for coming. We hope you enjoyed it, and Sandy will be here for a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. I know there was, you sent me an email today about somebody wanting some written material on this. And if you want to leave your name with Heather, I can get you some material on it if you want to read up. You can go on the internet, and there's information on the internet about the KOW. There's not a lot. We're still trying to get some more information from the Freedom of Information Act, because there's probably a lot of stuff in Washington we're going to try to, it should be unclassified by now. Back then a lot of this stuff was classified information. You couldn't get a lot of information. But we're going to see what we can get more information on it. Yes, ma'am.
There weren't a lot of
personal photos, like from the families that work there?
No, they were not allowed, they were not permitted to take photos. In fact, one instance, the woman told me she was working there. Her brother or brother-in-law pulled up to the front gate to pick her up, and they saw a camera laying on the back seat of his car, and they took the camera. And I said, whatever happened? She said, they gave it back to us at the end of the war. But there was another fellow that was caught from Cochrane, I believe, that he wanted to take a photo. Well, bam, he was arrested like right now, because that was a federal. You weren't allowed to take photographs. So I don't, now I do have a couple photographs that were taken supposedly by the guy that was caught and arrested, and he made duplicates. They made him turn in all the photographs, but supposedly he kept some duplicates. But that was a no-no. You weren't allowed to photograph anything. They were very strict about that. Thank you again for coming, and I hope I enlightened you a little bit.